Okay, so thank you to Babayit for hosting. Right, this week is week after Hanukkah, we have Tevet. I want to talk about miracles and like what is the function of miracles, and what do miracles matter? Why do they matter? What do they mean? And then a little bit about what that means for us today in a world where I would say that for most of us we don't necessarily feel like we experience miracles, certainly not on a regular basis. So I want to start off with a question like, what is a miracle? You have any thought? What makes something a miracle? Here, it might help that I just say, I think it's interesting that we use the word miracle a lot. I'm going to use it throughout the class. But the miracle is not a Jewish term specifically. It comes from Latin miraculum, I think. I looked it up at some point. Hebrew has a lot of words for what we call miracles. The closest one to miracle, to things like a wonder, things like a pella, some sort of crazy thing that happens. But what the word that's most commonly associated with miracles in Hebrew is nes. And the word nes means like a supernatural event that occurred, but it also quite literally could mean a banner, a flag, a sign that associates with someone. And the function of a miracle, we're going to look at sources that say this more explicitly, is that it is an event that is in some sense like a banner of God, that represents God as a moment of sort of divine presence, much more than it's about, say, the supernatural, or the breaking of nature, what we tend to associate with the term. In that light, I want to look at this first source from Melachim Aleph. This is like the very beginning of Eliyahu and Avi's stories in Tanakh, which covered the end of Melachim Aleph, the beginning of Melachim Bet. He says, the Tanakh says, Eliyahu the Tishbi, an inhabitant of Gilad, said to Achab, who was the king at that time, "As the Lord lives, the God of Israel whom I serve, there will be no dew or rain except in my bidding." The word of the Lord came to him, "Leave this place, turn eastward, and go into hiding by the Wadi Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You will drink from the wadi, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So the story opens quite dramatically. Like no introduction to Eliyahu, just here's this guy from Tishbi, from Gilad. He says to the king of Israel, Achav, there will be a drought. And God says, okay, while there's a drought, you go live by this river, you'll drink from the river, and I will send ravens to feed you. And as he proceeded to do as the Lord had bidden, he went and stayed by the wadi, which is east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat every morning and every evening, and he drank from the wadi. So, miracle, yeah? The ravens are bringing him food. He's literally being fed by animals that are constantly bringing him food. I think that fits with this much more sort of standard way of thinking about miracles, as the emphasis being on breaking the laws of nature somehow. Not strictly speaking breaking the laws of physics. This is not how nature works. Animals don't bring people food and hand it to them and walk away. Certainly not in the wild. The Pasuk continues though. It says, after some time the wadi dried up because there was no rain in the land. Right? You can't live by a riverbed and expect to drink out of it if there's drought. And the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow there to feed you." And that's what happens. The rest of the story is that he goes to find this widow, and there's the whole longer story, but he's able to go get food there. But the text uses the exact same language that to describe God having the ravens bring him food, as God having this woman bring him food, which is, often not a miraculous occurrence. It doesn't seem anything miraculous about some woman's going to give him food. So those are the key aspects of what a nes is. What I'm going to mean when I use the term miracle tonight is that it's not about breaking the laws of nature. It's at a moment when God intervenes in some significant sense. That could be that it breaks nature. God sends ravens to bring him bread and meat. I don't know where they're even getting meat. Or God sends a woman to bring him food and water. That's not miraculous. I mean, you have to be some sort of prophet, maybe, but there's no breaking laws of nature there. And the common element between those two is that it's an act of divine intervention, of God intervening and consciously, doing something for a person, a nation, etc.
Can you say that God intervenes at all time, and then would you consider everything a miracle? I mean, you said that God creates the world every moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does it count?
That's a good question. And it's sort of a debate throughout the Jewish tradition how we think about things that don't look like miracles. Because miracle is in some sense, and this is where the breaking the laws of nature aspect really comes in, it's some sense about our experience of the thing, right? What we call a miracle is when we experience as a miracle. We experience it as somehow different from the normal routine. In later texts, this becomes the distinction between not miracle in nature, miracle in normal, whatever, but the distinction between revealed miracles and hidden miracles. What we think of as normal is hidden miracles, and what we think of as miracles is revealed miracles, open miracles. So that is one way of thinking about it, yes. I'm more inclined towards thinking of it in terms of normal and miracles instead of hidden miracles and revealed miracles, because I think human consciousness, but also the text of Tanakh and stuff, it seems to describe everything not as hidden miracles, God doing it all the time, so much as God created a certain norm, which a certain normal way things are, with which God is free to sort of play at all times. But there's a lot of it. It's one of those things with a range of opinions. Any other questions? So the next text I want to look at is from the Rambam, Mishnah Torah. In Mishnah Torah, Yesodei Torah, the laws of the foundations of the Torah. And Rambam's going to talk about what he thinks miracles are for and what they're not for. He wants to sort of attack the idea that you might prove anything based on a miracle. That is, you might. There's a tendency to sort of see miracles as confirming that God exists, that God chose us, something like that. The miracle is going to demonstrate some broader idea. And Rambam really wants to sort of attack that. He doesn't think it works. So the context of Rambam, he's to talk about really, why did the Jews believe in Moshe? Was it because of miracles he did? On some level, Tanakh would seem to say, yeah. Like, Moshe actually asks God, why should the people believe in me? And God gives him miraculous signs that will be why the people believe in him. So Rambam's going to look at what some of the miracles actually mean, and why we shouldn't try and use miracles as sort of proofs for things. So the Jews did not believe in Moshe, our teacher, because of the wonders that he performed. Whenever anyone's belief is based on wonders, the commitment of his heart has shortcomings. In Hebrew, yesh belibo dofi. Because it is possible to perform a wonder through magic or sorcery. Right? You can't necessarily demonstrate any sort of truth based on a miracle, saying, because what if it's not really a miracle? What if it's someone doing something? All the wonders performed by Moshe in the desert were not intended to serve as proof of the legitimacy of his prophecy. Rather, were performed for a purpose. It was necessary to drown the Egyptians, so he split the sea and sank them in it. We needed food, so he provided us with manna. We were thirsty, so he split the rock, providing us with water. Korach's band mutinied against him, so the earth swallowed them. The same applies to all the other wonders. Right, so he's saying the function of miracles in the desert is not to prove anything, not to demonstrate some bigger idea. Moshe is God's prophet or whatever. Just as a functional necessity. God is taking care of business. How does God take care of business? With miracles. So then Rambam says, well then what is this? Why do the Jews believe in Moshe? If it wasn't because they saw Moshe do miracles. Because what is the source of our belief in him? The revelation at Har Sinai. Our eyes saw and not as strangers. Our ears heard and not another's. There was fire, thunder, and lightning. He entered the thick clouds. The voice spoke to him, and we heard, Moshe, Moshe, go tell them the following. That at Har Sinai, and this is from the 19th chapter of Shemot, before the Ten Commandments, in the 20th chapter, Bnei Israel personally experienced God speaking to Moshe, and that is why they believe in Moshe. Not because anything Moshe did, but because they're able to see firsthand that Moshe is a prophet. So the basic ideas here, essentially two different ones. One is, why don't we believe in Moshe based on miracles? Because, sorry, 1 second. Because miracles are fundamentally unrelated to Moshe being a prophet. There's a broader problem with trying to prove things. For the most part, you end up creating a sort of two-step process. There's a thing you've sort of proved and the idea you're actually trying to get to. And we've based the second one on the first. In this case, it would be Moshe did a miracle, and we're based on that, we're assuming Moshe was God's prophet. But that means that if you could, for whatever reason, suggest that Moshe didn't really do a miracle, or I'm not saying like it could be sleight of hand, then you would no longer be able to believe that Moshe had done a miracle, and that Moshe was a prophet. So what does let you believe in something? How do you avoid the two steps? Is by having a direct experience of the thing you're actually sort of wanting to believe in. Believing Moshe is a prophet doesn't require something else to prove that idea. It requires a direct experience of Moshe being a prophet. I'm going to look at a short piece from an Israeli rabbi named Rav Shagar, who analyzes this Rambam in this sort of way. His Rambam thought that faith that is based on miracles is faith that has flaws. A miracle that is presented as a proof for faith is forced on a believer artificially from the outside, such that there will always remain a gap between the believer and their faith, through which doubt can slip. Okay, so Rav Shagar here is saying that Rambam, his problem with miracles and faith, the connection between miracles and some form of belief, is that, as I said before, there's a sort of two-step process, right? Miracles and faith. Because there's two different steps, there's two different moments, there's a gap between them. And that you can always have something, pry the two apart, such as by demonstrating that one of them doesn't really exist, not really a miracle. So he continues, seeing miracles as proof for faith is a manifestation of a desire to hold on to the absolute. The absolute cannot be seized, it only reveals itself as an intangible and unmediated presence. The very logic of proofs defeat them, for they introduce a duality into faith that blocks the path to the absolute. When miracles function as proofs, they become a hard fact that externally indicate the pre-existence of God, and in doing so, they dissolve the realness of this existence and sustain the persistence of doubt. Saying that miracles are essentially foreign to faith in a sense. That faith is not about this sort of abstract idea that the miracle is trying to prove. And I want to come back to that, but first I want to look a little more at what miracles are for. I think it will push us towards a certain idea of faith as well. That will talk about what it means to believe and where miracles might actually be helpful for that. But it's going to require looking at a different source, another medieval Jewish philosopher. Instead of the Rambam, this is the Kuzari of Yehuda Halevi, one of the greatest poets of medieval Jewish philosophy, medieval Judaism. Also wrote a phenomenal book called the Kuzari, which takes the form of a dialogue between for the most part, of a Jewish rabbi and this Khazar king who eventually converts to Judaism. And in the early part of the discussion, the king asks, why do you believe what you believe? So at one point, the rabbi responds and gives him this mashal, this analogy or parable of the king of India. He says, the rabbi, if you were told that the king of India was an excellent man, commanding admiration and deserving his high reputation, one whose actions were reflected in the justice which rules his country and the virtuous ways of his subjects, would this bind thee to revere him? And sorry, the Old English, the easily available translation of the Kuzari is from the 40s. So we're working for. That's what we're working with. So would you be bound to revere or worship the king just because you've heard that he's great? India runs great under him. The Kuzari. How could this bind me when I'm not sure if the justice of the Indian people is natural and not dependent on their king, or due to the king, or both? there's too many different things I don't know that if any one of those facts isn't accurate, isn't exactly what I think it is, the whole argument falls apart. The argument that I should trust this king and revere him just because he's a great king assumes he's actually a great king. But what if he's not a great king? I have no way of really knowing because that's just something I've heard about him. And for the Kuzari, that sort of is the idea of philosophy. Philosophy, the Kuzari is not entirely against philosophy, but he's very distrustful of it. And one reason is because he feels like it involves accepting a lot of ideas that actually always have some sort of assumptions that don't necessarily work out. You always end up having to just take some things on faith in philosophy anyways. And because it's philosophy, you're lacking what he's going to talk about in the next passage, which is sort of... Yeah.
Is he asking here in 20 that if the people follow the laws because they are scared in some way of the king? If they are following the laws because the laws are...
So he's essentially challenging. There's a lot of reasons that people could be following the laws. It could be because they're afraid of the king. It could be because the king has taught them the right thing to do. It could also be that it's just what they were doing anyways. Maybe they naturally act this way, and the king just made laws that look like how the people act. He says there's no way of knowing if the way they're acting is because the king made them that way. So that's not a proof that I should listen to this king. So the rabbi continues. The rabbi said, but if his messenger came to you bringing presents which you knowest to be only procurable in India and in the royal palace, accompanied by a letter by which is distinctly stated from whom it comes, and to which are added drugs to cure thy diseases, to preserve thy health, poisons for thy enemies, and other means to fight and kill them without battle, would this make thee beholden to him? Al-Khazari, certainly, for this would remove my former doubt that the Indians have a king. I also acknowledge that a proof of his power and dominion has reached me. And so what happens if, instead of hearing like a fact about the king, somebody told you, and you have to figure out if it's true or not, you received something concrete. He gave you a letter for things that could only be from him, if things that preserve your health, poisons for your enemies, things to cure you. Would you believe? It is absolutely.
But there's two separate things going on. Because here, first he's talking about if you heard about this guy and you just heard about it, would you have to revere him? And then later on it's talking about would you owe him something? That's two different things. I can owe the bank and hate them. I mean, it's not. They're two separate issues there.
That's true. I'm always a little nervous of being.
I mean, I don't know what the original, it's
right.
in translation.
This is what I was about to say. I'm a little nervous of being too specific with language and translations, particularly because, unfortunately, the Kuzari was written in what's called Judeo-Arabic, Hebrew letters, Arabic language. So I am honestly not even qualified to judge the original if I saw it. But certainly from within the broader context of a discussion of why are you Jewish and stuff, and why do you believe in the God of the Jews or the King or whatever. I don't think it's super different to say revere and be beholden to him.
I think it is. I think there's a difference between saying I'm doing it because I think it's a good thing, and there's another, as opposed to, as in I'm choosing it because I believe it's the wisest option, or I believe I have a shiur.
Right.
That's a huge difference.
So it is, but I think in both cases it has a positive evaluation. You wouldn't get to him saying, I have a shiur even though I hate it. Meaning there's a sense of gratitude involved in this shiur. I agree with you, there are different things.
I mean, I don't know that you would necessarily assume gratitude.
Right, so as I was saying, from the broader context of this is an argument for, or an explanation of why the king the rabbi believes in Judaism, mm-hmm. and is arguing for Judaism. Mm-hmm. Anything he'd say would have a positive evaluation.
Oh.
But it's an important distinction, I think, that in some level this discussion of Judaism comes after the king has already interviewed and dismissed a philosopher. And part of the reason is that the philosophical religion of the Middle Ages, the Kuzari feels just leaves you with you can maybe end up revering God, but there's no service of God, and that's what the king is looking for, something to be more intense and this more sort of beholden nature. So the rabbi is saying, and the Kuzari, saying, the moment where you've had a real experience of something is clearly associated with the king. It could only be from the king. Moreover, it's like solving real problems in your life. Then you would have you'd have no doubts, and you'd have absolute proof, and you would be beholden. The rabbi says, in the same strain, Moshe spoke to Pharaoh when he told him, "The God of the Hebrews sent me to you," meaning the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. For Abraham was well known to the nations, who also knew that the divine spirit was in contact with the patriarchs, cared for them, and performed miracles for them. He did not say, "The God of heaven and earth, nor my Creator and thine sent me." In the same way, God commenced his speech to the assembled people of Israel. "I am the God whom you worship, who has led you out of the land of Egypt." But he did not say, "I am the Creator of the world and your Creator." Now, in the same style, I spoke to you, a prince of the Khazars, when you did ask me about my creed. I answered you as was fitting, and is fitting for the whole of Israel who knew these things, first from personal experience, and afterwards through uninterrupted tradition, which is equal to the former. What do you guys think of this distinction he's making between the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov versus like my Creator, the God who took me out of Egypt, or the God of heaven and earth?
I've seen an explanation that there's at least on the beginning of the Shemana Esrei, that like this is part of the idea that we're supposed to be constantly aware of, is the individual relationship that you build with God, not just the relationship built on your parents or their parents and such. It seems a little bit similar to that.
Maybe. I think we're going to get into that at the last part of this year. That's
okay.
where I'm building to. So keep that in mind. The second thing, a little different happening with the distinction between like the God of the Avot versus the Creator. Which is the Creator is like a universal truth, right? God is the Creator of everyone. God is the Creator, the God of the Avot, because of the specific and individual relationship. This is where it connects to what you're saying. The individual relationship he has with the Avot and then with the people of Israel, Bnei Israel. That God is not the God of Bnei Israel because he's the Creator. He's the God of Bnei Israel because he took Bnei Israel out of Egypt, because there's some sort of direct and continuing relationship. And that actually also comes back to the question of being beholden, which is that, and he says this in the 27 or whatever, the paragraphs following this, that mitzvot don't apply to everyone. We don't say like everyone has some sort of obligation to do mitzvot, certainly not the same level as Jews, because no one else has the same sort of direct relationship with Jews, with God, as the Jews do. The direct relationship of the Jews, starting from Egypt, leads to a special and more intense form of obligation and relationship. So he's saying that I don't believe in God because God is the Creator, because there's some sort of abstract idea of God that I could prove that's true. I don't believe in the King of India, or because it's demonstrated that it's true no, the actual relationship we've built through the miracle things the King of India has done for me, the things God has done for me, creates a relationship. It creates some sort of requirement for me to respond.
But it sounds like Rav Shigar would disagree with the Khazar.
Why would you say that?
Because the whole idea of once it's a matter of proofs, he's saying that then if you give a proof, you can disprove it, and if it doesn't mean anything in terms of once you're dealing with power, God's job isn't threatened by what Becky Bierman does or does not believe,
Right. So I don't think the Kuzari is framing this discussion as sort of demonstrating. I think he's already moving away from proving. He wants to say that it's like he says, I have the language is proof. I acknowledge that a proof of his power and dominion has reached me, 100%. But the emphasis, I believe, is clearly on the the good things the king has done, and the immediate experience of the king involved in this. So let's look at the next paragraph, which is going to be how Rav Shigar reads the Kuzari. I think it's something a little different from that. This is from an essay on miracles from Rav Shigar for Pesach. He says, the Chaver, the rabbi of the Kuzari, also gives miracles a central role in the context of faith. However, rather than framing the miracles as a proof for faith, he says to create a connection to faith. The Chaver chooses to present himself to the Khazar king as believing in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, who led the children of Israel out of Egypt with signs and miracles, who sent Moshe with his law. The king is confused by this confession and asks, "Now should you, O Jew, not have said that you believe in the creator of the world, its governor and guide, and in him who created and keeps thee?" In response to the king's shock, the Chaver emphasizes the miracle of the exodus from Egypt as the basis of faith. The exodus from Egypt demonstrates God's direct personal relation to the Jew that transcends nature. This personal relation creates the Jew's connection to God and his Torah. The great revealed miracle demonstrates real divine closeness, and this closeness is itself the primary revelation of faith. As far as the Kuzari is concerned, miracles are not some momentary hocus-pocus. They are events that carry within them the sensation of a direct encounter with the wondrous, the mystical. This is the religious significance of miracles, without which they have no meaning. So what Shigar is trying to get at, and he uses the language of, which I remember the Hebrew here. This is my translation from the Hebrew. Usually I use the language of demonstration, but the idea is that the revelation of God, the miracle of God, doesn't demonstrate something outside itself. It's not like, oh, there's this miracle that demonstrates that there's a relationship God has with the Jewish people. It's that this miracle is itself a moment in that relationship. I like to use relationship metaphors in general. I think in this context, parenting is helpful. Like, we have a parent who does something for you, as simple as making you breakfast in the morning. That doesn't prove or that they have a relationship, they love you, they care for you. Like, no, that is the fact that they love for you. It is a moment of their love for you, and them expressing their love for you. Them making you breakfast, them buying you clothes you need, is part of them caring for you. And that sort of by accident also demonstrates that it's true. It has to be true that they love you and have a relationship with you, sort of for those other things, for that event to happen. But it's not itself a proof of that other thing. It's just, it's a moment of care and relationship. That distinction make sense?
So you're saying it's like it's an indication.
It's not an indication. It's
or a glimpse.
Like, it's important in itself. Meaning, revelation is not important because it tells us something about God in general. Revelation is a moment where we meet God, and that meeting is important. And that meeting is not separate from the relationship and telling us about the relationship. It is the relationship. In some sense, I think this is maybe really important for thinking about relationship with God in general, and where we're going to go with this, but also all relationships. Relationships are not abstract metaphysical ideas that you get glimpses of in interactions. They're made up of those interactions. That's why the idea of quality time that you spend with someone is an important part of a relationship. But I think people forget about how important quantity time is, I call it. That actually relationships are built out of just being around each other. Because then that's where the common shared space and time of the relationship comes from. So the relationship with God is not made up just of quality time. It's the time God spends taking care of the Jews, giving them stuff they need. Even though that's not a particularly deep, significant moment of divine human interaction when people are complaining about not having water and God gives them a well. But it's a sign of, it's a moment of care. Any questions? Wonderful. So I want to look for a minute at what this means for faith. And what is faith? This is going to be more of Shigar. And I think it requires sort of reframing faith to understand why miracles as a form of care, I think, is really important for faith, but not miracles as a form of proof.
You know what? Did he write in Hebrew?
Yeah.
Do you know what word did he use?
For what?
Faith?
Emunah.
There is the translation is.
Well, it depends. Because the problem is even the word faith has a lot of different meanings attached to it. There's definitely a lot to be done with the meaning of the word Emunah. You're going to look at what does it mean in Tanakh, where Emunah and even Emet are functions not of truth statements, that a saying, a phrase, is true. No, people are true. Actions are true. You do chesed v'emet. You do truth and kindness. And Emunah means something more like loyalty or trust than like faith in the sense of I believe in something. And that, Rosh Hashanah is not going to mention that, but that's in the background here. And he does quote that in, I think, the essay we just read from about Kuzari. I think he mentions that as well. So here this is from an essay called My Faith, which includes a lot of different topics, like a whole bunch of different things, but also generally about faith. He says, in context of faith, philosophies and outlooks are, in this context, nothing but rationalizations, apologetics even, whose sole role is to justify what has already been arrived at, and which must thus be regarded with a certain wariness. They are not the substance of faith, but explanations for it. They are ancillary to it and always involve a degree of duality. To paraphrase the opponents of Maimonides in his school, who stated that God whose existence must be proven is no God at all, I offer the absurd assertion that a believer who requires an intellectual proof for his faith is no believer at all. There is no proof of faith, and no certainty of faith to be gained with a proof. In any event, proofs do not impact our existence like a gun pointed at one's temple. They do not touch upon the believer's inner life. That is why, when it comes to faith, I prefer to use terms such as event and experience. God's presence in my prayers is as tangible to me as the presence of a human interlocutor. That is not a proof, rather an immediate experience. Similarly, I do not assert that the sight of someone standing in front of me is proof of a person's existence. That would be foolish. After all, I see you. Anyone want to venture what they think is like, what is faith, as Rosh Hashanah is describing it here?
It seems to point it's about action more than thought. When he says event and experience.
Yeah, I think it's definitely that. I think let's start with the more than thought aspect. I think that's the first thing he's doing here. Is he wants to reject the idea that faith is rebelling about what we think. We often think about as faith as what we'd call like unfounded or unjustified knowledge, right? I know that this table is brown. I know that that couch is blue. I know that God exists. The difference being that I have a good reason to think this table is brown and good reason to think the table is blue, and at the very least less good reason, if any reason at all, to believe that God exists. And that faith is when I don't have enough like justification to believe, but I believe anyways. And Rosh Hashanah say that's not what faith is. Faith is not some sort of idea, because then that's something you could theoretically try and prove. That's where proofs are attempts to justify knowledge. This is the problem with that, is that justifying knowledge always means there's your knowledge and the justification. And if you lose the justification, in our previous discussion, the miracle, then you lose the knowledge as well. What faith is an event, an experience, but it's like a person standing in front of you. Faith is to be in a situation of an experience of another person, a relationship with another person. To go back to the metaphor from before, you don't have to prove that your parents exist because you experience them. You have a relationship with them that's ongoing.
Yeah, but what if you imagine that you have parents, but you don't have? I mean, you can actually know that either you have parents or you don't. And then you can imagine that you have parents who can say, oh, I feel I have an experience with those parents, but actually they were imaginary. So, actually you can know that God exists or not, even though you have an experience or not. Maybe you're all just making it up.
Right, so you're 100% correct. And that's part of where why people talk about faith as sort of unjustified or unfounded knowledge, is that that's where the relationship metaphors break down, is that God is not as evident. So I want to come back to that. But I want to speak for a moment on a more theoretical level. In our context of our discussion about miracles, we're talking about miracles as like moments of care, of God caring for you, right? So if your parents care for you, then you have an imaginative. Meaning like there are moments of them actually doing stuff for you. You experience those moments of them doing stuff for you. Then something happened, something real happened. You imagine your parents and somebody was taking care of you. And so you might have to like totally reimagine the way you think about, who took care of you. It might not be your parents. It might be, a large elf coming down your chimney and leaving you fresh clothes for breakfast. But like there's someone you're in a relationship with, you may have misunderstood it. Another thing I want to mention here, this is a highlighted paragraph. There's no proof of faith and no certainty of faith to be gained with proof. In any event, the proofs do not impact our existence like a gun pointed at one's temple. They do not touch upon the believer's inner life. I think it's like a really important point he's trying to make here, which is that part of the reason that faith is not an idea is that faith, for Shigar, gets to like the very core of who we are. And the very core of who we are is not like thinking beings. Thought does not define us. There's so much more going on inside us. That's why he starts by saying, philosophies and outlooks are, in this context, nothing but rationalizations, apologetics even, whose sole role is to justify what has already been arrived at, and which thus must be regarded with a certain wariness. Which must thus be regarded with a certain wariness. That philosophies and understandings of God are always attempts, for understandings of faith, to explain our faith to ourselves. That first we have faith, and then we attempt to explain it. So that's where your question comes in. I might actually first have this relationship with, let's say, my parents. And that relationship with them, the shared space that we share together in the house, them taking care of me, is what comes first. And my attempt to understand that comes second. And to understand who my parents are, or who God is, comes second. And part of that's because we're not primarily thinking people. We have, before you ever understand your parents, you have received things from them and you have emotional reaction to them. You loved your parents before you ever begin to understand them. And the same thing is really true with faith. You have a relationship of faith before you can ever have a cognitive understanding of faith and of God. As we just to flip back to page number 1 for a second. The previous Rav Shigar piece. Yes, the last line of the page. So the miracles function as proofs. They became a hard fact that externally indicate the existence of God, and in doing so, they dissolve the realness of this existence and sustain the persistence of doubt. They indicate the existence of God externally. As we said, there's trying to stand outside that sort of moment, saying that there's the thing that's happening is separate from the relationship itself, and that proves it. No, the Rosh saying no, they're the same thing. The relationship is bound up in that moment of care, and because they separate the two, they make it seem that relationship a lot less real. It becomes a cognitive thing, which is not as compelling to us. And most of all, they sustain the persistence of doubt. Because once again, they've reduced faith to this cognitive thing that we have to then try and justify. And that just never quite gets there. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay, so I want to move into the last section of the shiur. I think we're making good time. I want to talk about what does it mean to... so we say throughout Hanukkah, "She'asa nisim la'avotenu." You did miracles for our forefathers. In this time, in those days at this time, right? What does it mean to think about miracles not in the present tense but in the past? To think about care as something you received as this thing that's compelling, but is not something that you experience. Anyone have any thoughts so far? What does that make you guys think of?
The Seder. The idea that part of I'm trying to find the right word, religious experience is the idea of convincing yourself that these things that happened in the past, like the Exodus from Egypt or Hanukkah or whatever, are directly happen to you, so that you bridge that gap where it's like, no, I was taken out of Egypt, and then you have that gut level emotional connection with it, because you say that this thing, okay, it happened a long time ago, but actually it happened to me, and you identify with it on an emotional level.
Right. So that's one, I think, of the ways Jewish tradition does that. Talking about you don't experience it yourself, but the ability to sort of give yourself that experience of it. And that's a really sort of critical aspect of, you're saying the Seder, Hanukkah, etc. I want to look at a slightly different take on it from a very interesting thinker who's alive today. His name is Yishai Mevorach. He's a student of Rav Shagar's. I think he has a very compelling understanding of the idea of a brit, what a brit is. He's going to talk about like what Abraham's brit with God was about, what that means for us today. This is from his book, Theologia Shel Chesed, the theology of absence. With those who are standing here with us today before the Lord our God, and with those who are not here with us to this day, it's from Devarim. These words correctly present the deep meaning of the biblical idea of a covenant, which means being a sign, representation of the past encounter, of the moment of responsibility and obligation towards the other who confronts me. That a brit is somehow about being in the present, a symbol of the past. Similarly, for the father of the nation, Abraham, I will maintain my covenant between me and you and your offspring who come after you as an everlasting covenant throughout the ages, to be God to you and your offspring who come after you. As for you, you and your offspring who come after you throughout the ages shall keep my covenant. Every male among you shall be circumcised. This will be a sign of the covenant between me and you. This shall my covenant be marked in your flesh as an everlasting pact. If so, maintaining the covenant means being a body that expresses the past as a past that was in a present that has nothing of its own. Maintaining the covenant means living without revelation or redemption that happens to me. Instead, I see myself as offspring who come after, as a symbol of the event and the encounter that was. He says that Brit is about let's start with the sort of secular metaphor of a Brit, which is like a contract, sort of agreement. The way a contract works, you have two people or two entities who come together and say, we're going to make a deal. And after we make that deal binds us, right? Before we make the deal, it's all about what we want and our conscious intent. After that, we actually have sort of made ourselves subject to this agreement. This agreement is bigger than either of us and binds us. And so the covenant is a moment that's forged out of revelation. The Brit with Hashem comes from a moment of God and Abraham interacting, God and the Jewish people interacting. But it becomes something that's bigger than either God or the Jewish people. And this is what's going on in the famous Gemara of Tamur Shel Achnai, of God saying, I'm committed to however the Jewish people want to interpret the Torah. But here, saying about what does it mean to be part of a Brit that came before us. The Brit is something that extends forward in time, regardless of whether or not miracles continue, regardless of when that revelation continues. So for Abraham, that meant like part of what he's committing to is a future he'll never see. But for us, it also means committing to a past that is not like committing to miracles that are not something we ever experience, but they're part of our past. And saying an important part of who I am, what my identity is offspring who come after. That we see ourselves as people for like an important part of our identity is that God did miracles for our forefathers. It's an important part of who we are, even if we don't ourselves experience the miracles. I think actually that, in a sense, leads to what you were talking about, the sense of making yourself remember the miracles if they happen to you, is a way of sort of performing our identities as Zera Asher Ba'acharei, the children who come afterwards, of reinforcing that identity and passing it on to our children. The Seder is a really sort of incredible moment of education of exactly this, of how do you teach people to be part of a chain that starts with a story that they don't experience. How do you give people that sort of identity and narrative?
It seems like this plays a little bit into the idea of, I forget the exact phrasing, but of the moral in Netzach Yisrael, that's like the singular neshama of like all of Am Yisrael, that we're really part of this greater unity that we're a specific point on the line, but we're still part of that one greater whole. And that we're identifying the brit that was established earlier in time, and we're identifying that's still relevant to us because that's also a part of us.
Yeah.
Past as well as future.
I mean, like Yishai would not use the same sort of nishama kohelet language or whatever, but yeah, basically, is the idea that we are part of the same group fundamentally. He used the symbol here of the Brit Milah, because it's a very vivid symbol, but in general, he's also very interested in like bodies, not specifically gender, but we have born into our bodies in some level, just because we're born into a specific family and culture. Our past sort of baked into us, and that like in our very like birth, we are born Jews with this past of miracles that didn't happen to us specifically individually, but are part of who we are. So I think he's been much more oriented towards the like material element than say the neshama, but essentially, yeah. Okay, and no other questions. I want to look at a last source that is going to give another relationship take on the relationship metaphor from the same book by Yishai Mevorach. This is in a sense a little bit farther afield, but I think it's really interesting and helps shape this way of thinking. Here he's going to talk about marriage. A covenantal life is when two people willingly exist as representations of a moment of revelation, the engagement that happened in the past. In their past, there was a face-to-face, panim el panim, a moment of revelational responsibility, and now the couple are a symbol of that time. A life of covenant is not about the other who reveals himself to me, but the other who revealed himself to me, and I, the face who was the address of that revelation. Here too, as with prayer and the commandments, secularized Western culture boldly tries to fill a couple with tension and expectations of revelation. This is why couples are always told about the workshops at classes, magical getaways with useful atmospheres, bungalows, taking time away from parenting, analyzing attention, and so on and so on. Ideas to that end, all just so that the couple will resume discovering each other and revealing themselves to one another. However, this is all Christian, as Franz Rosenzweig would say. Someone who wants to hold on to another who is currently revealing himself without any disruption is asking to live without a covenant. In a covenant, there is no revelation, only a faithful representation thereof. This forces or coerces a person to carry the covenant onward toward the children who bear its sign. So Yishai is attacking very heavily a sort of Western culture, pop culture idea of romance. That romance is, or like love is about romance, about I'm like helping you reach self-expression, you're helping me reach self-expression, we're just like totally in love with each other. This is that like a relationship is a lot more than that. A relationship is busy lives, it's all kinds of stuff, and there's no like peak level of romantic experience that is constant throughout a loving relationship. It's just not a fact. It's not how it works. And therefore, there's like the West is always trying to get you to find new fixes, right? You can always find something to get you back to that level of excitement in a relationship. And really, you should just recognize it comes in and goes, it gets in and out. It's just a fact. You don't worry about it. But I think I don't want to go too much towards the like relationship therapy aspect of this. There's like significant ramifications for how we think of the covenant. First, though, I want to say I think this is also useful for thinking about the ketubah. A ketubah is like a bit of a weird thing that we do. It's a divorce contract essentially. Like it's not even quite a marriage contract. It's like based on this marriage, if we get divorced, here's how the finances work. Or if he dies. And we make really fancy ones and put them on the wall. But there's something that I think can be seen as a very like deep expression of love bound up in that moment. The same way when we said a contract is when two people make themselves subject to a contract. A ketubah is when the people signing it say, my love is so great that it transcends my actual immediate feelings. That like so essentially the man is saying, to the woman, I love you enough that even if I stop loving you, I want to still be taking care of you. That my love for you transcends my actual feelings towards you, is greater and more important than my actual feelings towards you.
So technically you could love anyone. I mean, that you can marry anyone because if your love depends only on the actions, then and not general feelings, then any person is like the same.
I would say not any person, meaning you have to be able to you have to sustain a relationship together, like in the immediate experiences of living together, right? The covenant is about this shared life together in some sense, and shared space. So, in context of Bnei Yisrael, it was very hard for God to maintain a covenant with Bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael were always, and Tanakh uses this metaphor, cheating on God. You can't maintain a relationship with someone who doesn't want to have a relationship with you. But in a real sense, yeah. The Western discussion of romance puts all the emphasis on what I'm feeling right now towards the person, and so because of that, I have to care the most I ever cared about the person at that moment. And when I stop caring about them, the relationship makes less sense. Why are we still together if I don't feel the same way I once did?
But that's the thing. It's in the same way he brings up also is that you once did. Two people as representative of a moment.
Yeah.
That existed. At one time, you had to be really into each other.
Right. So, no, there has to be something that starts it, and then it's a question of how does it exist over time.
Person.
Yes, also true. Yeah, it's a very good point.
To respond to this thing.
Yeah. And so for Bnei, in context of Bnei Yisrael, and this is the same sort of discussion of there were miracles in the past. They don't have to be miracles all the time. In a sense, Jewish history is a story of the lessening of miracles, starting from Yetziat Mitzrayim, and throughout the desert there's lots of miracles. So if you have shiur, there's still miracles. The very beginning of Sefer Shoftim, maybe there's miracles. And after that, there's very few national miracles left in Tanakh. A couple here and there, some small individual people get miracles, but there's a story of less and less miracles over time. This is not how our relationship with God works anymore. But the sense of miracles as God's care for the Jewish people is a very important part of the story we tell ourselves about who we are and how we understand ourselves. Is we are Zera Asher Ba'ach Arei, the children who come after, the people for whom God did acts of care, who God took care of in the desert. I think it's an important part of thinking of who we are. Particularly sort of the week after Hanukkah. We spend Hanukkah, as you put it, sort of trying to make ourselves think about those miracles and feel them again. Was accustomed to sit staring at the candles, thinking about the miracles. But now we're the week after Hanukkah. There's a lot more daily life and a lot less candles, a lot less miracles. So for me, this is sort of how I think about miracles. A very important part of who I am, not sort of that God did miracles for me, but that I am part of the people for whom God did miracles once upon a time. Thoughts? Questions?
It's similar when you have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, and then for a while you have nothing.
Yes.
For a month or more than a month, you have nothing. It's just normal life. After you die, then you.
Yeah, Cheshvan is the sudden mundane everyday after the peak of Tishrei.
But that's the test. You put in the sustaining peak, you had with Ego.
Yeah.
They had the high, but if you just run on that high, it self-destructs.
Yeah.
That's why the second set of luchot that they had to build were less miraculous, and those were the ones that endured.
Yeah, there's a midrash about what's the difference between the first and second set of luchot. The first one was with fanfare and fire and everything, and so the second one were tznua. There was a quiet to the giving of the luchot and the revelation there. There was because it wasn't this big dramatic thing, it actually had much more staying power. Also, one of my favorite texts ever. There's Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook. Cook has a passage called in Orot called Chacham Adif Min Avi. The prophet is the sage is preferable to the prophet, which is self-aligned from Bava Kama. But he wants to talk what that means. Is the prophets are poets and artists, big picture people, full of these bombastic speeches and stuff, and they never succeeded in getting rid of idolatry. Who succeeded in getting rid of idolatry? The Chachamim created all of the details of a worked out halacha that governs every aspect of our life, that builds a structure, a routine, and that's actually what helped the Jewish people really be in the covenant with Hashem, is not the big speeches of the prophets and the big moments of God's, Ne'um Hashem, God says, think moments of like, no, I'm building my life in a certain way based on my relationship with God. I'm putting myself consciously into a relationship with God, even in the absence of Ne'um Hashem.
But that was also like a very cognitive approach, like as opposed to the
right. No,
the
so
gut
so.
approach. Like the Chacham versus Navi, like Chacham is based on a rationalistic.
I don't think it has to be something like a rationalistic in the broadest sense. It is a conscious and intentional, and in that sense, like very. It's not just another word. It's not. It is consciously worked out, but it's not focusing on the intellect. That gets very bodily. It's going to give you things to do at every stage, and it's creating routines that you don't have to think about. It is just part of who you are. And overall, like, lots of good, social research, science research on like how do people change their lives in different ways. It's not based on like how they feel on the inside. It's about structuring your life and creating routines and habits. So I guess that, in some sense, also what I'm saying is that like the miracles are not things that happen to us today, so much as about the way they've become the mitzvot we do and what we do, and they adhere in the story about those mitzvot. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again for Bavai for hosting.
Thank you for coming.
For the show.